So welcome to Examining Waste Inequity with Data here for the NYC Open Data Week 2021. Welcome, hello. We're really excited that you all could join us here today. I'm going to briefly go ahead and get through my presentation here, which is just like a brief introduction to what everybody's presentations are going to kind of touch on in more detail, and then just to give more of a contextualized overview of what waste inequity actually is and how it impacts our daily lives. So first, what exactly is waste inequity? My definition is the ways in which the compounded effects of public policy, city planning, and structural violence result in harms and hazards that disproportionately impact chronically disenfranchised communities with respect to waste. But what we're really talking about is how things like racism, classism, and ableism, settler colonialism, and toxic capitalism put certain communities at more risk of dealing with the harms and violence that are brought on by things like plastic pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and the placement of landfills and incinerators. The brief agenda: we're going to start with some guiding questions that have been guiding my own work. Then we're going to move on to what these actual harms and forms of violence are. Then we're going to get into what waste materials literacy is, which is actually a term coined by Meredith, who is here with us. Then we're going to talk about the democratization of waste management. And then we're going to talk a bit about ecological reparations and what that means. On the right-hand side here, these are just 4 books that are just really central to my own research, and I recommend that you all read them. But at the end of this presentation, we'll also be sharing a waste inequity reading list that we all have been putting together over the last, who knows what time is anymore, but we've been putting it together. And so some of my questions are: in what ways are individuals complicit in waste inequity? What is the relationship between waste and structural violence? And what enables the perpetuation of waste-related harms? So some of these harms and forms of violence, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of them. Air pollution particularly, it directly impacts people's respiratory systems. Research that came out last year actually showed that it impacts pregnant and birthing people and their unborn children. And there are also just issues related to exposure to air pollution in young children related to asthma. And beyond air pollution, though, there are several other harms that people are forced to face, like toxic chemicals in food, poison drinking water, disease-spreading pests, destruction of ecosystems, and just at the very basic level, sanitation worker dangers. It is actually one of the most dangerous professions in the world, and it's often met with fatalities and just a lot of dangers on the job. And during COVID, for instance, numerous sanitation departments across the world had to fundraise for their own PPE because city budgets didn't allocate for it. And this led to, sadly, a lot of deaths and just a lot of preventable harms. And then, of course, mass displacement of large groups of people due to the effects of air pollution, and then how all of these things further exacerbate the climate crisis. So moving forward, here's a great quote here, and it's just that good governance of waste systems requires reliable information to evaluate whether recycling programs have their intended benefits, whether questionable disposal practices have been greenwashed by labeling them as recycling, and whether environmental crimes have been committed. But if you want to take away anything from this quote, just look at the yellow: reliable information and environmental crimes. Those 2 things are why we need to talk about waste materials literacy. Waste materials literacy is basically what is waste or garbage or trash or whatever you call the things that you throw quote unquote away, when in reality there is no away. And that's the importance of waste materials literacy. It really lets us know what these things are that we're consuming, that we're buying, and that we're sending to landfills or not sending to landfills by way of things like composting. Then this idea of inaccessible information. Some of the things that we don't know, it's not just that we're either not seeking them out or we don't just have access to them, but some things are deliberately hidden from us. The reasons are varied and people have different arguments for what those reasons are, but the basic point is that there's a lot of information that is inaccessible to us. And then of course, these things trickle down and impact our personal waste habits. Here, I'm just going to stick again to the yellow to talk about the main things that you need to know about these particular issues, which are the actions of large corporations, the direct and immediate impact that we need to be having on our communities, equitable access that we do not have to things that could be having a positive direct and immediate impact on our communities, and the relationship between waste and the climate crisis. I will make the slides available at the end of this if anybody wants to read the whole quote. I'm just trying to make sure I get through this for time. So democratization of waste management, what exactly does that mean? How can we make it so that people have the conditions of possibility to be able to make direct changes in their immediate communities? Hyperlocal innovation, what can we do and how can we do it as fast as possible? 2, data justice initiatives. Will's going to get a bit more into this, so I'm going to leave that to him. And then community solutions, community-led solutions. Who lives in the communities? What do they need? What are they saying is going to benefit their communities? And how can policymakers, legislators make that possible for us to actually do? Finally, ecological reparations. In the yellow, we have here reparative framework, globalization, because reminder, this is an entire planet. And while we should be thinking locally, we should also be thinking globally because there is no planet B, as people say. And then of course, the main point, bias against communities of color. Now, what does this look like? It really starts with shifting how we even think about our relationship to the planet itself. It's not just this thing that we happen to be living on, it is something that we are living with and growing with and changing with. 2, approaching all of these issues that we're talking about through an environmental justice framework. And finally, land back. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that many of us are the descendants of stolen people that came to stolen land. And some of us are not descendants of those people, but we are descendants of the people that settled here and erased, displaced, and took over the land. So in thinking about all of these things, it's just important to focus, as I said in the beginning, where we are, why we're here, and why it's important to focus on the people that are disproportionately harmed, which are Black, Indigenous, and communities of people of color. Finally, I just want to add, while this isn't any of our fault at all, we do have a responsibility, and that responsibility is just to do what we're able to do as often as possible with whatever we have equitable access to. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Trash Club. And the Trash Club is a community platform for facilitating ongoing engagement with waste in New York City and beyond. Rashida Kamal is a research fellow at NYU and data journalist, and Morgan Mueller is an artist and researcher whose work examines infrastructural systems in the context of labor, resource extraction, and global trade. They're both co-founders of the Trash Club, and their presentation is going to introduce us to their environmental justice data project, which is aimed at making information about our relationships to toxic systems more accessible. And feel free to private message me any questions that you have. We're going to save all questions for the end.
Thanks, Jesi. And thank you, Open Data Week, for having us. So I'm going to give a little bit of an intro to some of the projects that Rashida, Emily, and I have worked on throughout the course of Trash Club, and then Rashida is going to dive a little bit deeper into some of our long-term projects. So as Jesi said, we're Trash Club, and along with Emily, Lynn, Rashida, and I started this community platform for kind of investigating waste and waste infrastructure around New York and expanding that throughout the country and hopefully eventually the globe. Next slide. So we really kind of come from a humble beginning. We all met in grad school, and we noticed that there was a lack of composting initiatives around the floor of our university. And so we kind of started a small composting club. And through that, we met neighbors and we started to collect data sets and really just kind of expand what our, just kind of grow with our interests. And through that, we started doing a semi-regular speaker series, which is kind of expanded to bring subject matter experts, artists, researchers, and more in to discuss their work. And this isn't just relating to trash as we kind of know it. This can be related to ecologies, infrastructures, and future thought as well. So some of the images shown here are through Dave Marin's Precious Plastics, based out of Parsons, Ingrid Burrington, who's an artist and researcher, their work regarding extraction and just general waste. And then we've also had Billion Oyster Project come and talk to us about their initiatives around New York. And yeah, so during the middle of the pandemic, we kind of really wanted to see if there was anything we could do to help in New York regarding the composting around the city. And because New York really shut down its composting in a lot of areas. And so through that, we started reaching out to some organizations, and that's kind of how we ended up meeting with Common Ground Compost. And we realized that we had a lot of commonalities with our interests and the work we wanted to try and do. And so it kind of began a long-term project, basically mapping waste inequity around the city. And it's definitely a long-term project that we're still in the very early stages, but it's really kind of shown just how inequitable waste is. And I think just has been a very big learning experience for all of us. And then a final thing, we also like to collect all the resources we gather from both our speaker series and our weekly reading club that we have. And that is kind of where Rashida is going to take us from there, because one of the books we read for our reading club has really been foundational in some of the long-term projects we're doing, both with Common Ground and as an organization ourselves.
Thanks, Morgan. So the reading that Morgan kind of alluded to as being really core to guiding our thinking for how we think about particularly toxic waste in our spaces, in our cities and towns and states, and of course, in our nation. Dorcetta Taylor's Toxic Communities was a book that we read together last semester, and we included both students from NYU, but also local community members. And it was really a framework to help us think about this area. In Dorcetta Taylor's Toxic Communities, it basically asks the question, why are hazardous or toxic facilities so often in proximity to minority communities? And in order to examine this question, Dorcetta Taylor, or Dr. Taylor, really asks us to question the underlying assumptions behind the proposed reasons that people might put forth. So some of the theories of unequal exposure, the things that are cited have included disproportionate siting and discrimination, internal colonialism, market dynamics, which can mean anything from like, oh, it was cheaper to host our hazardous facility on this spot, to legal and regulatory and administrative contexts, which can look like, oh, a local ordinance allowed us to cite it here, whereas local ordinances were stricter elsewhere, or the manipulation, enticement, or environmental blackmail. I mean, blackmail is relatively self-explanatory. And other considerations that also are sometimes cited include unique biophysical characteristics or zoning and residential segregation. So throughout the course of this book, Toxic Communities, Dr. Taylor really walks us through each of these possible reasons and thinks about the history and the methods of how these reasons might have come to be and how they interact with one another. So in examining these questions and examining this, the trend of toxic communities, she asks us to consider a few key questions that she proposes should really be the core of how environmental justice scholarship is done. So the questions she asks us are, what are the current demographics of those communities where facilities or hazardous facilities are cited? And then she asks us to consider what were the demographics when that facility was first cited, because that can really be two different circumstances. Another question she asks us to consider is, how did the residents of this community respond to this? How did they respond if that particular facility was later designated as something else, and to site remediation plans? Another set of questions is, and this is really key to Dorcetta Taylor's thinking, is who has the ability to move? And how were the citizens' responses related to the demographic changes that were experienced by the community itself? And importantly, partly because this is often cited as a reason to cite these hazardous facilities, what were the economic impacts of hazardous facilities on the host community? And in considering these questions and the possible reasons for hazardous sightings, she proposes that we look at a few examples throughout recent history. One such example came from North Carolina and the consideration of toxic release facilities in that state. And part of what Dorcetta Taylor tries to do throughout the book is to think about, how do we make these trends legible? And one thing that becomes immediately clear is that the legibility, so for example, in this particular map that we're seeing per capita income in a choropleth map, and we have the designation of particular toxic facilities noted in circles, larger and smaller if they're emitting more and more waste. As we start to zoom in closer, we begin to see that there are actually some interesting trends in how the siting of those facilities are. At different levels of resolution, we can start to see that, oh, there are actually quite a few clusters of toxic release facilities in areas of lower income. The reason we bring this up is, one, yes, it's Open Data Week, and we need to think critically not only about the underlying data, but also the presentation of the data. And certainly for us, reading this book alerted us to some key ways of thinking about the ways in which geospatial analysis might fail. And so to introduce two important concepts from those readings, one that we encountered that we were not excited is the wrong word, but we were excited to learn it and to think with it, was the modifiable aerial unit problem. And this is essentially, particularly if you're used to working with census tracts and similar boundaries, something you might want to keep in mind is that these census tracts can sometimes mask things that are happening at the local level. And that masking can can mean that you're missing patterns of micro-segregation and clustering. So for example, the same data can sometimes yield different results when aggregated across different shapes or scales. A related problem is called the edge effect, which is that our census boundaries and really any geographic shape that we're doing geospatial analysis over, sometimes depending on how you've laid out that analysis, you want to make sure you're not assuming that the effects of a toxic facility stops at the borders, because often it doesn't. The mediums involved involve water, soil, air, and certainly those are not bound by those boundaries. So this is sort of a graphic to kind of bring it home. Essentially, if we might imagine the yellow dots on the screen as toxic facilities, we can see that the nearby circles numbered 1, 2, 3 here, though they are not in the same tract as a toxic facility, and therefore their average number of toxic facility for a census tract might be 0 for a given home. They are still quite close by, to illustrate the point that Dorsetta Taylor wanted to drive home for us. A really important thing that is related to not only this geospatial consideration is how all of this has evolved over time. Dorsetta Taylor, to quote her, says, "There's no question that spatial analyses have been enormously important to EJ research, but the time is right for a new generation of spatial analysis that makes a more concerted effort to take history into consideration." And this felt like the right audience to, talk about this particular point with. Something else that I would like us to think with is that the history of also our laws and how they're applied in environmental justice spaces. These are actually a law student's notes on the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is something to keep in mind if you're interested in studying environmental justice issues, particularly in the United States, because certainly it's one of those key pieces of our Constitution that affects the ways in which waste is cited. The main important point from toxic communities, at least for me, was to keep in consideration this ecosystem of actors and how they act upon how toxic communities are formed and maintained and perpetuated. And it really does go as far back as the Constitution in thinking about how the harms that Jesi kind of mentioned, how they're perpetuated today. It's really the ecosystem of actors, regulations, developers, local zoning that all comes together to make the world as we know it now. Dorsetta Taylor sort of leaves us with a really ambitious what to do next. She tells us, "It is clear from the foregoing discussion that EJ scholarship should adopt multi-method approaches that combine, for example, spatial, historical, economic, sociological, and planning techniques. Furthermore, EJ scholars should not be timid about developing interdisciplinary collaboratives to take more complex questions and to build more sophisticated models to explain processes and relationships such as those discussed here. Such collaborations could also devise strategies to support EJ claims making in legal and policy making arenas." And to turn it over to Morgan to talk a little bit about our own endeavor in that collaborative multi-method approach.
Dorsetta Taylor's work was obviously very inspirational to us. And using that as a jumping off point, we're working on another long-term project called Dispatches from the Toxic Commons. And we really want this project to be a living document and to gather community findings alongside data that we examine from each state regarding Superfund sites and toxic release TRIs. And basically, if the work of EJs or environmental justice scholars will teach us anything, it's that data sets are just one slice of what is happening in the community, and we want to continually layer that with more context. And so this context is really done through us kind of investigating states in these dispatches. So the first dispatch is going to be Alabama and Alaska, and that will be sent out by the end of the month. And then each month after that, we'll be continuing to send out dispatches for the following 2 states alphabetically.
Oh, I would also say, if Morgan mentioned that is an active layering that we want to do. It's not just engaging with the data sets. And to that end, if there's a state that's being covered and you have information or a story, we'd love to hear from you. And this is how to stay in contact with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yay, thank you, Rashida and Morgan. We're gonna move right along. And don't worry, at the end of this, we'll make sure we post links and stuff so you can all easily access all of this information. So the next person that's going to speak is going to be William Klimpert, and he is the data and systems analyst at Common Ground Compost. And as an avid nature enthusiast with a background in plant biophysics, he seeks to use data and technology to increase the accessibility of sustainability initiatives. His presentation will focus on the impact of confusing data on individual behavior and city policy in the wake of the New York City's halting of the curbside composting program. Take it away, Will.
Thanks, Jesi. Hi, everyone. As you heard, I'm William, and I'd like to take us through a real quick case study highlighting a particular relationship between data and waste inequity, specifically looking at, as Jesi said, compost drop-off sites during the pandemic. So before we can really dive into this, we need a little context. New York City started its compost project in 1993, and this program has grown over the years to now have compost drop-off sites in every borough run by 7 partner organizations. Along with that, New York City in 2012 started its curbside composting initiative, which, while there is struggles to equitably expand this program are a matter of a longer conversation, it's still nonetheless important to note that both of these programs were put into place to improve access to local, sustainable, and equitable waste management. So that's the good stuff. Unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, New York City run compost was almost entirely halted. So the curbside compost program lost its funding until at least July of 2022, and the city-run drop-offs lost much of their funding and have also been dealing with problems due to city regulations around social distancing. So this is all to say that just like everything else in our lives right now, city composting fell prey to these unprecedented times. And so you might then be wondering, where does data come into this? And the interesting thing with this issue here is once the city slashed funding to its compost initiatives, there was an immediate and significant need from community members to find out where they could continue composting. And so fortunately, there were several maps and lists that detailed compost site information, but all of these maps and lists had different data underlying them. And so some of these might have had one compost site, but not another. Some of them might have had more up-to-date information on which compost sites were open and which were closed. Some of them might have had more accurate information on what materials were accepted on one compost site or another, and so on. And so because of this problem, folks saw a need and an opportunity to create kind of a definitive list of compost drop-off site information. And out of that, we actually ended up with multiple quote unquote definitive lists of compost drop-off site information, but all of these definitive lists were slightly different from each other. They all had slightly different data. So we still ended up with kind of an extension of the same problem. So for once, we have a situation where our main problem here isn't that we don't have too little data. It's really that we have misaligned data. So I want to take a few minutes here to look at this from a couple different perspectives and see what are the effects of this mismatched data. And starting importantly with the individuals who just want to find out where they can compost their food scraps. At the very least, these folks need to know what's the nearest compost site? Is it open? What are their open hours in their days? What materials do they accept? Do I need to pay to compost there? What are the other procedures involved in composting? Those are the very necessities for them to be able to compost at all. Along with that, they need this information to be able to update. They need to get up-to-date changes on these, because the interesting thing about this situation that we're in is procedures and the locations of drop-off sites have changed frequently during the pandemic, especially in the early days as people were still trying to figure out what is this new normal going to look like. So the problem with this unaligned data here is that individuals trying to compost might see some compost sites on the list they're looking at, but not the closest. Or they might see some information about their compost sites, but not all of it. And this leads people to either not compost at all, or to compost but not follow the rules correctly. For example, in the image I have on the screen, not knowing the open hours of a compost site and just leaving your compost there. And this leads to a pretty clear mess for the existing drop-off sites. So that's another group that's been highly affected by this. These existing drop-off locations need to not only get themselves on all of these maps and lists, but they also need to be able to get accurate information about their operations to individuals. And they need to be able to know what's going on with other compost sites in the city, because that in turn affects their own operations, what's going on around them. And when we have here mismatched and very decentralized and non-centralized data sources for these compost sites, it gets very difficult to communicate with composters, because you don't necessarily know what list they're using to find out what compost site to go to. And you don't have a streamlined way to inform composters of any change of service or updates or reminders of your procedures. And this leads to even more frustration from composters and from drop-offs. So much frustration, I'd say, that you might wonder why anybody else would even want to get involved in such a complicated data mess as this. But fortunately, we've been seeing throughout the pandemic that there's been an inspiring amount of new drop-offs popping up all over the city to try to fill in this void that's been left by city-run compost initiatives, so that we can kind of keep up access and maintain access to this sustainable practice. And in order for them to do that, they have to first know when and where the demand of these services are. You know, you can't, if you're trying to increase accessibility to compost, it's not really going to work if you have two compost sites on top of each other on the same day at the same time. So they really need to have up-to-date information on where all of these operations are. They also need to know about the structures and the procedures that are working well for other existing compost operations. And most importantly, they need support from the community to be able to start and continue their new compost programs. So they need donations and funding. They need publicity. They need this, going back to that streamlined avenue of communication that I talked about earlier between them and individuals of the community that would benefit from their services. So it's no surprise with all of this then that these mismatched data sets present an uphill battle for these new and prospective compost drop-off sites, just like they did to individuals looking to compost and already established compost drop-off sites. So with all of that said, before we're done with this Spark Notes quick case study here, I want to take a little step back and look at what the underlying problem was here and how we can address this in the future. So the case of this misaligned data brings up an important question of who should maintain data. And more importantly, is it the responsibility then of each of these groups managing lists and maps of compost information to constantly be scouring the web and calling up compost operations to make sure that they have the most up-to-date information as possible? And so now we get a little opinion-y in this case study, but I would argue that it's not reasonable to expect that, especially considering that funding right now for compost operations and compost in general is so scarce. It's very hard to expect anybody to spend all of their time trying to, either figure out what's going on with other operations or post to all of these different maps. Along with that, it's not a particularly scalable solution. As we head towards a more accessible and connected compost landscape in New York City, there are going to be more and more of these compost sites to keep track of. So the answer then, going back to this need for a streamlined avenue of communication that I just can't stop talking about, is collaboration. So we need to make sure that there's one underlying fundamental data set that compost sites are either pushing to or pulling from. With a system like this, individuals would know where to go for accurate, up-to-date information, and compost site managers would know where to go to update that information. So in fact, this sort of free sharing and coordination of data opens up potentials for even more data to be promoted and distributed in order to keep making these systems more accessible. So one example of that I just want to touch on really briefly is compost drop-off tonnage. In New York City, we have publicly available data for yearly tonnage of food scraps dropped off yearly at these city-run drop-off sites. And I look towards and I admire a system more like Jersey City's, where they have monthly updating data that's broken down by which city-run location it is. And if we start to head towards a kind of a more collaborative approach, we can head towards a system where we have this communal data both with the city-run programs and also community-led programs, so that we can get an even more granular look of where we're succeeding in this and where we really need to work harder to reduce waste inequity. So all of this is to say, there's clearly more work and research to be done. But this small case study, I think, highlights the fact that sometimes the issue isn't always quite as simple as get the data out there. But we need to intentionally plan our data frameworks to support the work that we're doing. So we got through that fast, but I hope it provides at least a little primer on this example of a data relationship with waste inequity work. So with that, I think I'll kick it back to Jesi.
Thank you so much, Will. That was awesome, as always. Next, we're going to have Meredith Danberg-Ficarelli, who is the director of Common Ground Compost, and she sits on the U.S. Composting Council Board of Directors. She's a member of the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board, woo woo, and she's also a member of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's Community Composting Coalition. And in 2019, she was recognized by the New York State Association for Reuse, Reduction, and Recycling with the Recycling Leadership Award. Her presentation today is going to focus on waste materials literacy and the importance of transparency in waste management.
Yeah, thank you, Jesi. Intro to Common Ground Compost, what we do. So in the interest of kind of democratizing access to waste information and bad jokes, I'm going to take out the trash on this presentation here. Get used to it, guys, if you're a waste data nerd. So first, I'm just going to talk about how trash works in New York City, kind of wrap all this together. We have a system that is split in half between what the Department of Sanitation, or sort of our public agency, manages and what private commercial operations manage. So the Department of Sanitation collects residential waste and institutional waste and material from government buildings, public schools. And on the commercial side, it's all other businesses, all businesses. So you have the Department of Sanitation collecting half of New York City's waste. That is a unionized public workforce. And then you have 90 commercial waste hauling companies collecting everything else from every commercial office building, bodega, and every other business in New York City. We're talking about around 21,000 tons per day of material. It's actually hard to know because while the city gathers good data, as we know from open data, the commercial data is a bit harder to come by. Every individual hauler is managing that information themselves. You know, what it looks like, roughly looked like before the pandemic, that is, the Department of Sanitation collects trash, glass, metal, plastic. We focus on organics at Common Ground Compost, so that's what you're seeing here. And then commercial waste, you know, we're talking about, again, different scales of collection of different material types. And the pandemic really had huge impacts on the collection of organics. And even of trash, street litter bins, there have been huge problems with waste collection in New York City, and those impacts have been disproportionate. There, you know, the certain communities are more impacted by street litter than others right now. We're talking about a lot of waste every day, filling almost 1,700 school buses worth of trash, of waste in general, of material, leaving the city every single day. And as Jesi touched on, all this stuff goes somewhere. There is no away. We're looking at a landfill here on the left and an incinerator-ish on the right. different technologies for different places, but essentially we're shipping our trash outside of the city. We put it in our bin and then it disappears, magic, right? But no, somebody has to bear the burden of that material, whether it's nearby in toxic communities, essentially in Newark, New Jersey, and elsewhere in that area because of the siting of incinerator infrastructure, or as far south as you can see here as Waverly, Virginia, which Jesi has done some research about the communities there that receive New York City's landfill waste or have received it. Huge amounts of money are being spent to do this. Roughly $400 million a year, probably more than that right now. I haven't checked that stat actually. Sorry, friends. Poor data there. What we're doing with our work, aside from advocacy and zero waste consulting, is microhauling. We collect food scraps by bike through our Reclaimed Organics program. And the idea is relocalization. We're talking about green jobs, obviously, riding bicycles to collect food scraps. You can't really get more green than that. We collect food scraps and we process them in a community garden. And the goal is to take trucks off the road, or at least to improve the efficiency of routing of those trucks. When we look at scale, the point of microhauling is to be micro. We're not trying to collect 64-gallon containers, which can weigh 250 or 300 pounds when they're full. We're talking about 8 gallons or 5 gallons. For reference, if a 5-gallon bucket is full of all coffee grinds, like dense, wet material, it'll weigh 30 pounds, right? So heavy, but manageable. And that's what we're talking about, collecting small scale from small businesses and residents who aren't of the right size to need a large container, but they still want to compost. Everybody eats, everybody has food scraps for the most part. Microhauling looks something like this. We are not the only ones doing this in the city. This was our very first trailer scale, tiny little, like behind a bicycle. Then we upgraded to a 6-foot trailer. Now we have electric assist cargo trikes. This one's name is Thunder. We're an evolving operation. And our microhauling operation was also impacted by the pandemic. I'll talk a little bit about composting later, but in terms of scale, at our peak this time last year, we were doing a lot of consolidation so that a truck could come to us. So we were serving more than 100 businesses with our small scale pickups, and we were consolidating into 5 points, and then a truck was only stopping at 5 points and collecting material out of these giant green bins. And so the truck made 5 stops instead of 105. Also, our city run drop off, or we operated it, but the city did the collections, has been shut down since then. And since 2014, since we launched, we've diverted more than 300 tons of food scraps from landfills by bicycle and through, like I said, on scale processing and through these consolidation points, as we call them. This is at our community garden in the East Village. This was definitely at our peak. And then this is in a loading dock of a commercial building. We developed partnerships to park this material and have commercial haulers collect it for us. How does what we do relate to the larger scale? And how does this relate to waste inequity and environmental justice? New York City is changing its commercial waste structure through a plan called commercial waste zoning. These are heat maps. So on the left, we're looking at the status quo. Essentially, the vehicle miles traveled right now of commercial waste trucks. And then on the right, we're looking at a new system, a different approach, a reduction in vehicle miles traveled of those same trucks and their routes. And what we're looking at right now is what this says: map of routes servicing customers in Bronx Community District 2 in one day. Every color is a different truck route. So these are different companies, different trucks. They're all going through this community where waste infrastructure is sited, and then they're going all over the city. I cut this map short. It goes way further, right? So unnecessary miles traveled, tons of inefficiency in these routes. And what we're looking towards is a system where the city is breaking up into 20 zones. And there's a huge process underway right now to make this happen. But essentially, the geography will be limited. So there won't be as much inefficiency. That's a drastic oversimplification of commercial waste zones, but you get the idea. And, mapping and impact, these are some of the reasons that, waste data matters to us. But we are also a consulting company that tries to help businesses reduce waste. So understanding what the business generates is really important. And also understanding how this looks different from one type of business to another is really important. So while a restaurant, the green piece is their food waste, more than 50% of a restaurant's waste might be food scraps. An office is going to have a lower proportion, right? And there are trends across these different industries. And while our data set is relatively small, because we are a relatively small consulting company, we have found trends, and it's been really exciting to be able to dive into this data. In the city, on the residential side, what we're looking at here are two different visualizations of the same information. So the city does a waste audit of residential waste a couple times every decade. And on the left, we're looking at current behavior. 80% of what New Yorkers throw away goes into a trash bag, not into a recycling bin. So this is the current behavior chart. And then on the other side, we're looking at the potential. So what's actually in those bags? 34% is potentially compostable. Food is the heaviest and wettest portion of the waste stream, so it's the most expensive portion to transport. And it's also there's nutrient dense material that could help improve our soils. It can help sequester carbon. It can help keep stormwater in our soils and reduce the impacts of combined sewage overflow, which you should look up. Combined sewage overflow. If you haven't heard of it before, you're going to be grossed out. Meanwhile, a lot of food is wasted, right? 40% of what we grow in our country never makes its way to a plate. This really cool chart is from an organization called ReFed, if you haven't heard of them before. Sorry that some of my charts are a little clipped here, but meanwhile, now, as of like 2020, 2021 pandemic times, 30% of our population is food insecure. So we are discarding edible food and we can't feed everyone in the country. It doesn't make sense. The US leads the way. We're wasting 40% of our agricultural production. The world wastes 30%, right? So we're doing better than everybody else. No, we're doing worse, but everybody's doing a bad job is what I'm trying to get at. And it's a really big problem. And what options do we have, right? What's going on in the city? We're composting at a lot of different scales and with different technologies. I'm gonna sit on this slide for a second because I think these visuals really help. We need every scale of the solution in order to solve our waste problems. We need to recognize where large-scale infrastructure is sited so that we can reduce the negative impacts on already marginalized and disenfranchised communities. So that's some of this larger infrastructure. We need to recognize where there is potentially city-owned land that could host community-scale compost operations that not only divert waste, but also act as excellent educational opportunities for kids and all neighbors. It's an opportunity to engage with your community and basically help people recognize the connection between waste and our food system, which is a connection that has been broken. And then the smallest scale, this is actually my dad outside Boston, but you get the idea. Not everybody has a backyard, so this isn't always possible, but there is, there's value and there's potential in every single potential backyard or fire escape, don't tell the fire department, to be also, operating as part of this big system. And the image, so this bottom right image is an industrial scale compost site. This one is the Newtown Creek wastewater digestion facility. And what we're looking at on the right side of this slide is on the top, we're looking at anaerobic digestion, which is one type of organics recycling. And on the bottom, we're looking at composting, which is aerobic. And those words mean anaerobic is without oxygen and aerobic is with oxygen. So these are two different processes. They utilize different microorganisms, but they both recycle organic matter. And there are a lot of ways for us to be doing this work, and we're just not really doing it yet. And obviously, we're all really jazzed about how this can work. We'll see if this video plays for me. This is my last slide. Just to speak to what we should be doing, source reduction is number one. stop throwing things away and stop buying things that you're going to throw away. Then make sure we're feeding people. Then we can feed animals. And then it's all these different types of composting, prioritizing the composting that is happening closest to the site where it's being generated, so we can reduce those transport impacts. And I'll just play this one more time because I love this video. This is a process that we were utilizing in our community garden called bokashi composting, where phase 1 is a fermentation phase, and you just saw the bin get opened after the fermentation phase, and then we compost it in an aerated static pile bin that forces air through the bin to help kind of speed up the composting process. And that is happy white mold on the top, which is, you know, a really important decomposer. So that's the end of my slide deck, and I'm going to stop sharing so that we can hopefully take questions. And thank you, Open Data Week.
Thank you, Meredith. That was awesome. So you guys can either put stuff in the chat if you have any questions, but kind of just to piggyback off of what Meredith said for a moment, like mold is incredibly important in a compost pile, and so are things like protozoa and bacteria and all these other little creatures that all have their own little job and their own little purpose in the compost bin. And one of my favorite just like metaphors for life and the world is to just look at our own human world as if we're in our own little compost bin, trying to navigate through all of this waste and all of these things that we can turn into something better. And so maybe that means just, you know, really realizing what is it that you have to offer the rest of the world, and just play to your strengths, like bacteria. And yeah, so while we're waiting for questions to pop up, and you can also feel free to just unmute yourself and ask if you want, I'm going to post a resource list that we all put together called the Waste Inequity Reading List. I just put it in the chat. And it's just a list of podcast episodes and books and articles that we recommend you all check out. And it just all has to do with waste. And yeah, as I said, you can put any questions you want in the chat, or I could just keep rambling. That also works. Rashida and Morgan, is there a link, or can you post a link to how people can access your dispatches?
I'll jump in for 1 second and just say, Jesi, thank you for moderating. And Jesi runs the Common Ground Compost social media, which you can find at Common Compost on Instagram and Twitter. And we're also at Reclaimed Organics. So that's Jesi's voice there. Jesi also pens and collaborates with Joe on our team on a monthly newsletter. So I'm going to drop the newsletter sign up link into the chat in case anyone is interested. You can just stay tuned on all things waste.
And I can for sure make my slides available. If everybody else wants to make their slides available, yeah, you can do that. And what I'll do is I'll update on Twitter and on Instagram to where everybody can find the slides and such. And I just want to drive the point home again that a lot of this stuff feels really helpless and dismal and terrible. And while it is, it's also other things. It's not just all bad. There are some things to look forward to, and we can make direct impacts at the local scale. And it really does just come down to, you know, doing what we can when we can. And when we do the things that we can together, it makes it even not easier, but just not as difficult. And so I hope that as you all carry on with your days today, you thank your local sanitation workers because they're awesome, and our world would fall apart if not for sanitation workers, literally. And I hope you all compost if you can. And yeah, if you want to tweet at Common Compost with any questions you didn't get to ask during the session, that's totally fine. But if maybe everybody else wants to give any sign-offs, last words.
Thanks again for joining us. Thank you so much for NYC Open Data Week for hosting us.